The list in my pocket was a litany of mundane items, but it felt good to have a purpose, even one so trivial. As I walked, I noticed the rhythm of my footsteps on the pavement, a solitary beat against the hum of the city. The market wasn't far, and I appreciated the chance to stretch my legs and clear my head. I was halfway there when a prickling sensation shivered up my neck. It was as if the city had suddenly gone quiet, and I was left on stage, the sole actor in a play I didn't audition for. I glanced back, expecting to catch the eye of a friend or perhaps a neighbor offering a wave, but there was no one. Just rows of houses, each mirroring my own, and the empty streets stretching behind me. I shrugged off the feeling and continued, my pace a little quicker now. The market was its usual self, a sanctuary of the familiar. I weaved through the aisles, picking up items without much thought. But as I reached for a carton of eggs, I caught a swift movement from the corner of my eye. I turned, my heart skipping, but again there was nothing amiss, just other shoppers immersed in their worlds. On my way out, the sensation of being watched returned. It hung over me like a cloud as I stepped back onto the street, now noticeably quieter as the day approached evening. The once comforting bustle of the city was retreating, leaving a silence in its wake that felt heavy and unwelcome. I started for home, the contents of my shopping bag clinking softly. That's when I heard it, a set of footsteps, distinct and unhurried, keeping pace with my own. My skin prickled, and I told myself it was nothing, just another pedestrian, perhaps a resident heading home like me. But as I turned down my street, the footsteps continued, mirroring each turn I took. A spike of fear urged me to walk faster, and the footsteps quickened in response. I was being followed. In that moment, the streets I had known all my life transformed. Every shadow seemed to stretch towards me, every flickering streetlight a spotlight on my growing terror. I no longer felt alone, but for the first time, I wished I were. This section sets the scene, introduces the protagonist's routine life, and ends with the realization that she is being followed, which sets the stage for a chase. The story is grounded in reality, with the tension stemming from actual fears and situations that could plausibly happen to anyone. The rhythm of the following steps had synchronized with mine, a mocking echo bouncing off the concrete walls. The normality of an afternoon stroll had eroded, replaced by a cold dread that clenched at my stomach. I told myself to be rational, that there was a logical explanation for this, but comfort eluded me as the gap between the footsteps behind and my own seemed to narrow. I made a show of checking my phone, feigning nonchalance. No new messages. No calls. My screen became a black mirror reflecting a distorted version of myself, eyes wide with a fear I couldn't shake. I slid the device back into my pocket, resisting the urge to run. Instead, I turned onto a busier street, seeking the safety of strangers. People passed by, each absorbed in their world, oblivious to the drama unfolding in mine. I scanned the crowd for a familiar face, a guardian in this sea of anonymity, but there was none. The idea of approaching someone, anyone, and explaining that I felt pursued seemed absurd. I couldn't articulate this dread without sounding paranoid, and yet, the fear was real. I ducked into a cafe, the scent of coffee a brief solace. I pretended to peruse the menu, my gaze flicking to the window's reflection, searching for the owner of the steps. But the street view offered no revelation. My pursuer was either well hidden or unnervingly patient. After a moment that stretched too long, I stepped back outside, my exit casual, a performance for an audience I couldn't see. The footsteps resumed a relentless shadow that clung to my own. I crossed the street, the traffic providing a temporary barrier, and for a series of heartbeats, the footsteps ceased. A false sense of relief washed over me as I reached the park, the greenery a stark contrast to the hard cityscape. Here, there were more people, joggers, and families, a buffer between me and the unseen threat. I wove between the trees, the sound of children's laughter a bizarre soundtrack to my flight. I should have been safe in the open, but the isolation was palpable. The park was an illusion of security, a place where screams might be mistaken for play. I picked up the pace, the gravel crunching beneath my feet, my breaths coming in short bursts. I was running now, the pretense abandoned, my shopping bag abandoned on a bench, its contents spilled like an afterthought. It was then, in my escape, that I realized the footsteps had evolved. No longer a mere echo, they carried a weight, a presence that bore down on me. I dared not look back, for to see my fear incarnate was a reality I wasn't prepared to face. The park spat me out onto another street, quieter and lined with old houses that watched in silence. I missed the clamor of the city, the cacophony that could hide my panting fear. Here, every step was an announcement, a declaration of my vulnerability. I had to find refuge, some bastion against this relentless pursuit. My thoughts scrambled for a plan as I navigated the labyrinthine neighborhood, every turn a desperate bid for salvation. The sky, a dimming canvas, offered no counsel, only the closing in of an inevitable night. In this section, the protagonist's fear intensifies as she desperately seeks safety in public spaces, only to find that her pursuer is undeterred. The tension mounts as she becomes more isolated, despite being in theoretically safer, more populated areas. The story remains grounded in reality, with the chase rooted in genuine, relatable fear. The streets turned into a blur, each one indistinguishable from the next as I fled. My breaths were sharp, cutting through the silence that had settled over the neighborhood. The occasional bark of a dog or the flicker of a television screen in a nearby home did little to alleviate the sense of desolation that had enveloped me. I longed for the sanctuary of my walls, a door locked firmly between me and the world, but the idea of leading this unknown follower to my doorstep was unimaginable. Instead, I sought refuge in unpredictability, taking turns at random, doubling back in a desperate attempt to confuse and lose this persistent shadow. As the sky darkened into a bruised twilight, my options dwindled. The once welcoming lights of the neighborhood seemed to dim as I approached, as if warning me off. I considered crying out for help, but the stillness that answered me was a clear indication of my solitude. There was a sense of abandonment here, a feeling that the very streets I had known all my life had turned their back on me. The realization that I was truly alone was like ice water in my veins. I stopped momentarily, my mind racing. The footsteps had ceased. Was it a game to my pursuer, a cat toying with a mouse before the inevitable pounce? Or had I finally eluded them? The silence was as terrifying as the chase. Not knowing was a torture of its own. I found myself outside a small library, its warm light spilling out onto the steps. It was an anchor in the storm, a place that promised normalcy. With a surge of hope, I pushed through the doors, the familiar scent of books enveloping me. The librarian glanced up, offering a smile that I returned with a tight nod. I moved between the stacks, my fingers trailing along the spines of books, the titles a comforting murmur. But even here, in this bastion of tranquility, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. I peeked around a shelf, half expecting to see a pair of eyes glinting back at me, but there was nothing. No one. Settling at a table with a book I had no intention of reading, I tried to gather my thoughts. I could wait here until closing, but then what? The night held a deeper darkness, and the thought of stepping back into it was paralyzing. As the minutes ticked by, the library patrons thinned out until I was left in a bubble of stillness. The librarian announced that they would be closing soon. My heart sank. The refuge I had found was slipping away, leaving me to face the night and the unknown once again. This section heightens the protagonist's sense of isolation and vulnerability. Despite finding a temporary haven, her anxiety persists, underscoring that nowhere feels truly safe. The chase has moved from the physical streets to a psychological battleground, where the fear of being followed haunts her every step. The librarian's voice seemed to come from far away, a gentle reminder of a world that was still turning despite my turmoil. I closed the book I had been pretending to read and stood up, my legs stiff from sitting. The thought of walking into the night's embrace was suffocating, but the library's closing left me no choice. I thanked the librarian, my voice a whisper lost in the expanse of quiet knowledge around me. The door closed behind me with a soft click, a sound of finality. The street lamps cast long shadows, and the trees swayed gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The town had taken on a spectral quality, a still life painted in shades of black and gray. I wrapped my arms around myself, not just for warmth, but for comfort. The absence of the footsteps was disquieting. I had grown accustomed to their presence, a strange constant in the chaos. Now, without them, I felt untethered, as if I might simply drift away into the night, forgotten. I walked, my eyes darting to every flicker of movement ever. Why, rustle of leaves. I had become an animal, prey to an unseen predator. Each street I crossed was a small victory, a momentary relief that I savored until the urge to look back overtook me. It was on the bridge over the river that cuts through town that I finally allowed myself to stop and take in the sight of the water below, dark and unfathomable. It was a mistake. The stillness was broken by the sound that had come to define my evening, a single set of footsteps, measured and sure. I didn't run this time. Instead, I leaned on the railing, my gaze fixed on the inky water below. The footsteps approached, unhurried as if they had all the time in the world. I held my breath, waiting for them to pass, to continue on their way and leave me be. But they stopped, just out of sight. Enjoying the view? The voice was male, unfamiliar, and alarmingly close. I couldn't bring myself to answer or to look at him. The river seemed to call to me, offering a solution so final it was almost tempting. "Nice night for a walk," he continued, oblivious or indifferent to my silence. "But it's getting late. You should be careful. A girl like you shouldn't be out alone." The threat was veiled, but it was there, hanging between us as tangible as the bridge under my palms. His presence was an invasion, a violation of the solitary sanctuary I had found in my fear. I nodded a mute response and pushed away from the railing. I walked away from the voice, away from the river, and the dark thoughts it stirred within me. The night was no longer quiet, nor was it still. It was alive with danger, with the reality of my situation. I was being hunted, not by a ghost, but by a man of flesh and blood. And it was a hunt I was not sure I could survive. I walked with a purpose I didn't feel, my mind a whirlwind of panic and calculation. The stranger's words echoed, a chilling reminder of my vulnerability. I wove through the streets, now lit by the sporadic glow of streetlights that did little to penetrate the darkness that had settled like a cloak over the town. My apartment was close. The thought of home was a beacon. I could barricade myself inside, call for help, and wait out this nightmare. Yet, every step towards safety was shadowed by the fear that he was just behind me, biding his time. The sense of security I had once taken for granted had shattered, leaving me exposed to the sinister game of cat and mouse I found myself in. I reached my building, the familiar sight offering no relief. The locks on the door were a meager defense, but they were all I had. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them with a clatter that pierced the silence. My hands shook as I finally managed to unlock the door and slip inside. The darkness of my own home was suffocating. I didn't bother with lights. They would only advertise my presence. Instead, I moved silently to the window, peering out between the blinds. The street was deserted, a tableau of urban solitude that offered no clues to the whereabouts of my pursuer. I reached for my phone, the weight of it in my hand now a lifeline. The emergency number was dialed, and I waited for the line to connect, for a voice to answer and send help. But there was only silence. Confusion turned to horror as I realized my phone was dead, the battery drained from a day's use, and my failure to charge it. The walls of my apartment felt close, the air stale with the residue of my fear. I was trapped in my sanctuary, cut off from the world, waiting for a threat that lurked just outside my view. The night stretched on, an endless expanse of time that I marked by the sound of my breathing and the beating of my heart. Hours passed, or so it seemed, until the first light of dawn began to seep into the sky, a pale wash of color that promised a new day. With the light came a renewed sense of courage, a determination not to be cowed by fear. I would face this head on, I decided. I would go to the police, report everything, and end this torment. Steeling myself, I opened the door to step out into the dawn. And there he was, the man from the bridge, waiting with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning," he said as if we were neighbors sharing a casual greeting. "I thought you could use some company." The realization hit me then, cold and sharp as a knife's edge. There was no escape from this. He was my shadow, my fear was made manifest. But as the sun rose higher, casting light on the face of my tormentor, I knew I would not let the night's terror define me. I had survived until morning, and I would survive whatever came next. The early morning light did little to dispel the dread that had tightened around my chest. His presence, this man who had turned my ordinary day into a waking nightmare, seemed out of place in the gentle dawn. I took a step back, my mind racing for options, for any avenue of escape that I hadn't yet considered. "Stay away from me." I found my voice, the words sharp and more powerful than I felt. He raised his hands in a mock surrender, the smile never faltering. "I just wanted to make sure you got home okay. It's not safe for you to be out there all by yourself." The implication that he was the lesser of two evils, a protector rather than a predator, was ludicrous. Yet there he stood, between me and the world outside, as if he were the gatekeeper to my freedom. I couldn't let him see the fear that was clawing at me, couldn't let him see the effect he had. "I'm calling the police," I said, hoping the assertion would deter him, would drive him back into the shadows from which he had emerged. His laugh was a low chuckle, dismissive of my threat. "Go ahead. But we both know your phone is dead, don't we?" How did he know? The question circled in my head like a persistent fly. I had been careful, hadn't I? The realization that he might have been closer than I thought, that he might have been watching me for longer than I could fathom, sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. I retreated into my apartment, locking the door behind me, a flimsy barrier at best. The safety I had sought in the light of day was an illusion, one that he had shattered with a few casual words. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls a confining space that held no answers, only questions. The police. I needed to get to the police. But the thought of leaving my apartment, of potentially walking into his trap, kept me frozen. I was a prisoner in my own home, and he was the warden with the keys. As the sun climbed higher, casting beams of light through my blinds, I weighed my options. The daylight hours were my ally, a time when the world was awake and alert. If I were to make a move, to seek help, it had to be now. With a deep breath, I gathered the shards of my courage, ready to step out into the world that had become a chessboard for this twisted game of pursuit. With my hand on the doorknob, I braced myself for the next move. With resolve bolstering my shaky nerves, I opened the door. The corridor outside was deserted, the usual sounds of my neighbors' morning routines conspicuously absent. It seemed as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for what I would do next. I stepped out, locking the door behind me with a decisive click. The man from the bridge was gone. The space where he had stood was now just another part of the quiet hallway. I didn't allow myself to feel relief. His absence was just another strategy, another way to keep me off balance. My steps were measured as I made my way to the stairwell, avoiding the elevator. It was a small space, too confined, with doors that might open to reveal him waiting. The stairs were harder, my legs already weary from the night's exertions, but fear was a potent stimulant. As I descended, the silence was a tangible thing, broken only by the sound of my descent. I reached the lobby without incident, each step taking me closer to the outside world and help. The morning light streamed through the front doors, a beacon of hope that urged me forward. I pushed through, emerging onto the street, the sounds of the city greeting me like a symphony. Cars honked, people chatted, and the normalcy of life felt like an armor against the terror that had gripped me. I blended into the crowd, just another face among many, my anonymity a shield as I made my way to the police station. It was a short walk, one I had made before, but never with such a desperate purpose. With each block I put between myself and my apartment, the tightness in my chest eased slightly. I began to entertain the possibility that I might make it, that this ordeal could soon be over. The police station was a nondescript building, its doors a portal to safety. I stepped inside, the cool interior a stark contrast to the growing warmth of the day. The desk sergeant looked up as I approached, his expression one of mild interest. "I need to report someone following me," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt. "He's been after me all night." The sergeant's demeanor changed at my words, the boredom replaced by concern. "Let's get some details, and we'll see how we can help you," he said, motioning for me to sit. As I recounted the night's events, the fear, the pursuit, and the man's face in the morning light, I could see the skepticism in the officer's eyes. It was the same doubt I had seen in the faces of the people in the cafe, the same question that lingered unspoken: was this real, or the product of an overactive imagination? But as I spoke, the reality of my situation settled into the bones of the room. The sergeant's posture shifted, his attention focused. He believed me, or at least he believed that I believed, and that was enough to set the wheels of protection in motion. I was given a seat in the waiting area, a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hands, as officers moved about with a sense of purpose. I was no longer alone in this. I had advocates and protectors, and for the first time since the footsteps began, I felt a glimmer of something like hope flickering within me. Yet even as I sat there, surrounded by the everyday workings of the law, a part of me remained on edge, vigilant. I knew that until they caught him, until I could put a name to the face that haunted me, my story was not over. The game, it seemed, was still very much in play. The officers took my statement, their pens scratching across the paper, a sound that was both ordinary and yet now strangely comforting. They asked questions, their eyes never leaving my face, searching for truth in my answers. I told them everything, the sense of being watched, the man's approach on the bridge, his veiled threats, and the silent phone call. One of them, a young officer with kind eyes, offered to drive me home. "We'll have a patrol car keep an eye on your place," he assured me. The offer was a balm to my frayed nerves. I nodded, accepting the ride and the protection it implied. The drive was short, the streets passing in a blur as I sat in the back seat of the patrol car, trying to piece together the fragments of normalcy that had been my life just 24 hours ago. When we arrived, the officer escorted me to my door, his presence a solid guarantee against the fear that threatened to surge back. "Try to get some rest," he said. "We'll be close by, Just call if you need anything." I thanked him, my gratitude genuine, and watched as he walked back to the patrol car. The idea of rest was laughable, but the sanctity of my home was once again a comforting thought. With the police watching, I allowed myself to relax, to believe that this ordeal might soon be over. I made my way through the silent rooms, the normalcy of the space clashing with the memories of the night before. The light of day seemed to have erased the traces of my terror, leaving behind only the physical evidence of my flight, the discarded shopping bag, the spilled contents. I cleaned up, the act of putting things in order as a way to restore some semblance of order to my life. But as I moved about, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see his face pressed against the glass, his smile mocking me. The day passed in a haze of half-hearted attempts at normal activity. I tried reading, watching TV, even cleaning, but everything felt hollow, each action tainted by the undercurrent of fear that ran beneath the surface of my thoughts. As evening approached, the light began to fade, and with it, my sense of security. The patrol car outside was a distant silhouette, the officers inside anonymous guardians. I wondered if they truly believed they would see anything if they understood the cunning of the man who had followed me. I made dinner, the motions familiar and yet foreign, as if I were watching someone else move about the kitchen. I ate alone, the silence of the apartment a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Outside, the world was settling into the routine of evening, the streets quieting, the sky darkening into twilight. It was then, as I washed the dishes, that I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned off the water, my hands dripping, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I raised my eyes to the window above the sink, and there, reflected in the glass, was the face I had feared I would see. He was back, his presence an inescapable truth that no amount of police vigilance could shield me from. And as our eyes met in the reflection, I knew that the night was far from over. The real test was yet to come. The face in the reflection was a jolt of electricity, sparking a surge of adrenaline that propelled me into motion. I spun around, but there was no one behind me, just the empty kitchen and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I approached the window, my hands trembling, my eyes searching the growing dusk outside. There was no sign of him, no trace of the figure that had been haunting me, just the quiet street and the parked patrol car, its occupants obscured by the reflections on the glass. A trick of the light, a trick of the mind, I tried to convince myself, but the seed of doubt had taken root. I grabbed my phone, its battery now sufficiently charged, and dialed the police. The dispatcher's voice was calm, a stark contrast to the panic that threaded through my words. "There's someone outside my window," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The man who's been following me, he's here. An officer will be there shortly. Stay on the line with me," the dispatcher instructed. I peeked through the blinds, scanning the area for any movement. The officers from the patrol car were already on their feet, flashlights cutting through the dimming light as they checked the perimeter. They moved with purpose, their training evident in every step, but I could see their confusion. There was no one there. I relayed this to the dispatcher, my gaze never leaving the scene unfolding outside. "They're saying he's not there, but I saw him, I'm sure of it." "Stay on the line," she repeated. "Keep the doors locked. We're here to help." The minutes stretched out, taut lines that seemed to vibrate with tension. The officers knocked on my door, their faces a blend of concern and reassurance. "We've checked everywhere, there's no one out there," one of them said, his eyes scanning the room behind me, looking for signs of the intruder. I nodded, the fear and frustration a tight knot in my throat. "Thank you," I managed to say, though the gratitude was tinged with the bitter taste of unresolved fear. They left, and the night settled around me once more, a cloak that felt heavy with unseen threats. I was trapped in a web of my terror, each strand a reminder of the unseen eyes that watched me, the footsteps that followed me, the man whose presence was as ephemeral as it was terrifying. I settled onto my couch, the phone still in my hand, the line to the dispatcher my only lifeline. The night outside was a canvas of shadows, each one a potential hiding place for the man who had turned my life into a living nightmare. The feeling of being watched was a constant pressure, a weight upon my eyelids that I dared not close for fear of what I might open them to see. The hours ticked by, each one a note in the symphony of my unease. The dispatcher's voice was a distant comfort, a reminder that I was not entirely alone, even as I felt the isolation close in around me. The waiting was a torment of its own, a slow torture that frayed the edges of my sanity. As the first light of dawn began to seep into the sky, a weary peace began to settle over me. The night had passed, and with it, the immediate threat seemed to diminish. But the wariness remained a constant companion that whispered of dangers unseen and of the man who had become my shadow. I stayed on the couch, unmoving, as the world outside began to wake. The morning brought life to the streets, the sounds of a city beginning another day, and with it, the illusion of normalcy that I longed to believe in. But the truth was etched into the very fabric of my being. There was no normal, not anymore. Not for me. The sun rose higher, casting light into the corners of the room that had been shrouded in darkness. With the light came a semblance of strength, a determination that had been absent during the long hours of the night. I would not let this fear define me, I resolved. I would take back my life, one step at a time. But as I stood up, the fatigue of the night's vigil weighing me down, I knew that the journey back to myself would be a long one. The man who followed me had taken something essential, a piece of my peace of mind that I would have to fight to reclaim. The phone slipped from my hand, the line to the dispatcher finally going silent. I was alone, truly alone, but for the first time since the footsteps began, I felt a spark of something like defiance. I had survived the night, and I would survive whatever came next. The story was not over, but neither was I. As the morning matured and the sun claimed the sky, I stood by the window, the light washing over me, feeling like a survivor of some long-forgotten battle. I was exhausted, my body aching from tension and fear, but within me stirred a newfound resolve. I would not let this ordeal become the end of my story. I showered, letting the hot water run over me, attempting to wash away the grime of terror. But as the steam filled the bathroom, so did the shadows of doubt. Was I truly safe? Would I ever feel the comfort of solitude again without sensing the lurking presence of my pursuer? Dressed and somewhat more composed, I decided on a course of action. I would not cower in my home, jumping at shadows and waiting for the next encounter. I would go to the police station, demand action, and provide whatever details I could to aid in the capture of this man. Stepping outside, the air was crisp, a sharp contrast to the stifling fear that had kept me prisoner. The patrol car was gone, the officers likely assuming that daylight had dispelled the dangers of the night. They didn't understand that my foe did not abide by the natural laws of light and dark. The walk to the station was a mix of caution and courage. I kept my head high, my steps purposeful, but my eyes roved the environment, searching for any sign of him. He had become my constant, a sinister guardian angel whose purpose was to shadow and torment. At the station, I pushed through the doors, the buzz of activity a stark reminder that life went on, regardless of personal crises. The desk sergeant recognized me, his brows knitting together in concern at my haggard appearance. "I need to speak to someone," I said firmly. "He's still out there, and I'm not safe." They ushered me into a back room, where I retold my story to a detective whose sharp eyes missed nothing. He listened, nodded, and promised they well. They'd do everything they could. They would increase patrols, keep a watchful eye, and start an investigation into my mysterious stalker. Yet as I spoke, I knew that this was a man who didn't want to be found. He was a phantom, a wisp of smoke that slipped through the fingers of those who reached for him. But I also knew that I held the key, the crucial detail that would unravel his presence. As the interview concluded, the detective assured me they would be in touch, and I left the station with a police escort back to my home. The street was quiet, the normalcy of veneer that barely concealed my turmoil. The day passed, and with each hour, my home transformed from a prison to a fortress. I was safe here, surrounded by walls and locks and the watchful eyes of the law. But the true test would come with nightfall. Would he return to claim the fear he had sown, or had the daylight scattered him back to the shadows from which he had emerged? Night came, a gentle descent into darkness. I sat in my living room, every light ablaze, a beacon against the night. And as the hours ticked by, a quiet strength settled over me. I had faced my fear, stood up to the unknown, and I was still here. The footsteps had ceased, the watching eyes were gone, and I was left with the most powerful feeling of all, the knowledge that I had survived. And so, as the clock struck midnight, and the world outside settled into slumber, I allowed myself a small smile. The man who had chased me, who had stolen my peace, was nothing more than a specter now, a bad memory that would fade with time. I had reclaimed my life, piece by piece, and as I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I knew that sleep would come easier now. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a measure of peace. The story was indeed not over, but this chapter had come to a close, and I was ready to start the next, unafraid and free. If you liked the story, please give it a like and subscribe for more. Thank you for tuning in.